and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're in part 4 in the last of our series, The Great Leverage of Hunters, Deer Science. What we actually know about deer and how they operate directly translates into our hunting decisions and success, which is why this is super important for us to know as much as possible about. In this episode, we're joined again by Dr. Bronson Strickland of the MSU Deer Lab, looking at collared buck studies and what they show about hunting pressure and how it really affects buck behavior. And you're going to want to write some of this down to get the most possible out of it. Our free journal is the best way to do that. You can download it below. Okay, so here are the top things to look for during this episode. What do collared buck studies show about hunting pressure, and how quickly bucks will change behavior once we start hunting them? How do deer start moving once they feel this hunting pressure? And where should we focus our efforts as the season goes by? Is the October lull a myth or fact according to the science? And is there such a thing as a nocturnal buck? And what is really going on there? And there's a ton more high IQ stuff in there and a bunch of science. So let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. Okay, I'm here with Dr. Bronson Strickland again. And we're talking deer science, what I call the great leverage. Being able to take actual data and apply it to your hunting situation to really help yourself be more successful, right? And so if you didn't listen to segment 1 with Dr. Strickland, I encourage you to do that. There was a lot of good things in there that you'll get from that. In this episode, we're going to look at more detailed some of the studies from MSU Deer Lab where Dr. Strickland works. They've done these collared buck studies, and before we get into that, and one of these studies in particular, we have the Deer IQ test, and Dr. Strickland took it, and I thought this was very interesting. I've had most of the guests have taken it so far, and you and Dr. Carl Miller were the only two that added all these caveats to your answers. I just thought that was interesting and kind of funny. It made it a little harder to grade too, but
well, Carl was for my undergraduate, he was one of my professors. So Carl rubbed off on me.
Yeah. So if I was super strict, so it's a 10 question, it's really a short kind of fun quiz for people to engage with. But you can compare your results to the different guests. And if I was super strict, I would give you a 9 out of 10.
Oh, boy. Okay.
There was one, it was kind of because you added something to it, and I was like, but functionally speaking, you knew all your stuff for the 10 questions. So we could say functionally a 10 out of 10. But if you haven't taken that, you can go online and take that short, we call the Deer IQ test. But let's jump in then to... you did a study where you looked at, I thought this was really interesting, because a lot of people that hunt public land specifically, but even private land, realize that hunting pressure changes things. How much and how fast is always a question. I think a lot of times we lie to ourselves, honestly, and say, oh, what I'm doing isn't affecting that much, but it's other guys, right? But you did a study where you talk about tortuosity of bucks over a hunting season. And can you explain what that is and what that study told you guys?
Yeah, so that one was a little bit different than the study we most recently completed. It was more of experimental treatments. And what I mean by that is the property that we were working with, and Steve was the lead on this, but they were able to designate parts of the property, and it was a really big property, as zero hunting pressure, very light hunting pressure, and very high hunting pressure. So the landowner, the organization that owned the land, was able to manipulate how many hunters could enter this zone, how many hunters could enter this other zone, etc. And the big takeaway from that was that hunting pressure, number one, it did matter. And really how it was manifested was a metric that we call tortuosity. And so with that study, it wasn't like we saw after there was some hunting pressure, quote, the deer turned nocturnal or they just quit moving. We didn't see any of that. And I come back to saying something or reminding people of what I say a lot is that deer move every day. They have to. They have to acquire food every single day, a couple times a day to get food in their rumen. So deer are going to move. It's just really the timing of when they do it and where they move and how they do it. So what we saw in this study is after about 3 days, give or take, of hunting pressure in those zones, the deer more or less figured out, hey, there's something different. We have this predator that is on our landscape day in and day out now. And so their movement behavior became more tortuous. And all that simply means is more complicated and more complex. So think about if you were going to drive from this analogy may not work here, but work with me. If you were driving from New Orleans to Atlanta, it's a long distance. The amount you have covered, 600-700 miles, whatever that is. Now think of NASCAR, where you're going 600 miles or 400 or 500 now, but you haven't covered a great distance. You've just gone in an oval. You've still covered, 500 miles.
Yes.
You haven't gone anywhere. NASCAR would be a tortuous path. So when you looked at how far they would move in a day, it could be very similar, 1,000 yards, 2,000 yards, 3,000, whatever. But they were doing more very small and complex movements. And Adam, what we call it is between point A and point B with a GPS point, that's called a step length. And so those step lengths would be a lot shorter. And then the other metric is what we call the turning angle. And so that means from point A to point B, kind of the angle that the deer went. Did it go left? Did it go right? Did it go straight ahead? Did it go backwards? And so tortuosity is just a combination of a change in the step length and the turning angle that it used. And so the more hunting pressure mounted and built, the more complex and tortuous their movement paths would become.
Yeah, that's a lot to digest for guys, but it makes sense to me, and I think your analogy works well, right? I'm a science teacher, if people don't know that, and so when we look at physics and real simple, like we call it distance versus displacement. So displacement is straight line in what direction from A to B. Distance is just total, right? It's your odometer, right? It says, oh, this car went 100,000 miles. It doesn't tell you where it went. It doesn't tell you what direction it went, right? And that kind of made sense to me in the difference, right? The Indy car versus the straight line going down the highway to get to Atlanta. So you have this measurements of step length and turning angle. And so with no pressure, I would assume then deer are pretty much walking from bedding to feeding areas and back and forth in fairly straight lines that make sense, right? Because they have no reason not to. Right. And then all of a sudden this predator shows up and they have to avoid and stay alive, right? And so they're making all these twists and turns, or they're staying in one little spot and getting their food and their needs met in one little spot that keeps them safe. Is that generally what's going on?
Not generally. I think that is exactly what is going on. So what I attribute it to as well is that they have to be cautious. And so think if you were being hunted, think if, there's no risk on the landscape and you want to walk from, the bedroom when you wake up to wherever you're getting breakfast, and there's no risk, there's no history of risk. You walk straight there.
Right.
But if you're getting shot at the entire time, you're going to look around. You're going to be very cautious every time you take a step. Really, if you want to exaggerate that, think of a bow hunter when you've got a doe within 15 or 20 yards, and she knows a little something's up, and she's moving that head and stomping her foot and looking all around. And just kind of characterize that for that being more like a tortuous movement. They're more complex. They're more cautious. They're spending more time looking around for the next step length that they take. Is it safe or not?
Gotcha. Yeah. So the increased awareness causes them to do those sorts of things more often, and so they can't string a straight line together. Pretty much.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, just the analogy. I think a lot of times, if we just put ourselves in the place of a deer or the head of an animal, a lot of things would just start making a lot more sense to us, and we'd stop, saying things like, well, getting mad at the deer or whatever because they're not doing what we want them to do. But
they're trying to stay alive.
Yeah, they're trying to stay alive. And if between your bedroom and the fridge there were, people trying to kill you, you'd either figure out when they weren't doing that to get to your fridge, or you'd go to a different fridge, right? You just get out of there. I mean, it is really simple when you boil it down. And so you said 3 days of hunting pressure is what the study found was when deer figured it out, right? And so I guess for a hunter, you've got, like, let's say, especially highly pressured, and I'm in Michigan, so I'm thinking public land, and I'm like, I've got 1 day to a week at the beginning of bow season max until the deer have figured it out, right? Yeah. And so I've got a few days, maybe 1, maybe 3, maybe 5 if I'm lucky, depending on where it is, until deer figure it out and they're getting much more tortuous, and I have to change my tactics. So I can do a quick hitter type hunt, I would call that, and catch them before they figure it out, right?
Yeah.
But after
you would certainly hope that should be your goal, yes.
Yeah. But after 2-3 days, I got to change my strategies now. So what does this look like for hunters? And I'm also guessing, like, what do the areas look like that these deer are tortuous in?
Think of cover. Mm-hmm. Think of cover. Yeah. So they're staying in areas that are going to provide more visual screening, so that they can be hidden at least a majority of the time. Now, if a deer wants to walk out and take advantage of the acorns that are available at some point, they're going to have to do it. But they're probably going to spend more time behind cover assessing, looking, smelling, hearing what's in front of them.
Gotcha. What then should a hunter take from this as far as, okay, my tactics? So is it just simply as just getting to that cover once those few days are up? Like, you can always, I think, I was talking to somebody a while back, a deer farmer who kind of put deer in 3 categories, like really smart deer, the average deer, and then the really dumb deer. And most of us can probably shoot the really dumb deer. They might be really young or just haven't learned their lessons, right? And so those are the ones that probably get shot first. Mm-hmm. But as you get more average deer or the smart deer, like, it seems like a lot of times they just outsmart us. So knowing this, what should a hunter be looking for then, realizing that after a few times hunting, they're patterned by the deer, basically, right? Or the deer know. So now what?
I think, and just qualifying here that every place is going to be a little bit different, and hunting pressure varies from place to place and so forth. But if I were to generalize, I would say that earlier in the season, with less pressure, I would probably be focusing my hunting area and time. It would be focused more about food, because that's going to be a convergence point. There is going to be food. However, so then think of, let's say you had really light hunting pressure during archery season. That might be a food centric, time to where that's where I'm focusing my time. But then now we've got the opening weekend of gun season. So generally speaking, you've got 10 times the hunters are on the landscape. It's going to take 3 days to a week or so. Deer are figuring this out. I'm probably going to be focusing my efforts more on getting as close to cover as I can. Finding the areas, whether it be private land or public land, that have the most developed cover, and being very careful going in and scouting that I don't go in there in the heart of the cover to disrupt them and have another disturbance event there. Staying on the periphery, that is where I would go.
Yeah, I think that really boils it down simply, but it's true. You know, food is for low pressure, covers for high pressure, and
Right.
just a few days into it, you're starting to shift from the food to the cover if you can. That brings up another topic that gets talked about a lot is, deer patterns changing. People watch deer all summer, and we know that, you have the velvet shedding and the bachelor groups break up. So there's natural shifts in that as well as the food, right? Maybe beans dry up and now it's acorns. So that, I think, plays into deer movements and patterns. But you also have the pressure thing, changing it for them or forcing them to change some of these. But then we get this thing called October Lull, right? So do you think, what are your thoughts on October Lull?
Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. How much do you think you add hunting pressure where you hunt? Most people don't think they do, and most of us blame other factors like weather and the neighbors, but in the reality of it, we all add to it every time we step in the woods. As season goes by, do deer show up later and later to the plot? Do bucks that were on camera in daylight now show only at night? And here's the big question. Do you have to hunt more than a couple times to fill a tag? If any of these are true, you may be a reason for these changes in behavior and lack of success. Keeping a very close eye on how and when we hunt and where we hunt is key to keep this pressure low and your chances high. Being more strategic and self-controlled is vital, and coming up with a plan for this is something to really think about. And do you know your deer IQ? Do you think you're deer smart? Why don't you take our Deer IQ test and find out? It's quick and fun, and you can share it with a buddy and compare your score to theirs. It's linked below with a bunch of other very helpful stuff to check out, including our private Facebook group, our social links to actually connect and talk with me and other people there, and our newsletter so you don't miss any of our other weekly high IQ content. And if you struggle from year to year to be consistent on the best deer where you hunt, that's a problem for a lot of us, check out the Deer IQ services below designed to help you with just that. Okay, and now let's get back to the podcast.
With you being in Michigan and me being in Mississippi, I've got to say this. I don't like, and I know I'm being a nerdy academic here, but I don't like calling it October Lull because it should be framed relative to the rut. It should be the pre-rut, lull, if there were one. So that's part one. I think it's just that month before where you're at, and most of the Midwest, et cetera. October is the month before November, obviously, but November is usually the majority of the times the rut is in the Midwest. You've got to shift that a month or two in the Southeast. So where I'm at, the peak of the rut is going to be in December. Go further south, it's January. Go further south, it's February. So basically, let's just say it's the month before. Well, we've got a change that's going on there. So all during this time, we had the summertime, and we had the bachelor groups. And then the bachelor groups are breaking up. That could be September, even into October in some cases. And so bucks are going back to their fall, winter home ranges. And then we have the pre-rut is now moving in. So now we're having a change of behavior at that time. So now we're going from bucks that are maybe more going back to their home range. They're focused on food now they're focusing on scraping activity. Now they're focusing on going out and locating where those doe social groups and focal groups are at. So when you look at the data and you look at, if you wanted to measure it as the amount of movement each day, there is no October lull. It is more of a probably changing their movement patterns and the places they are. And then you will see the big spike. The big spike you'll see is pre-rut and rut.
Right.
So right before, so if you wanted to say there's really no difference in the movement rates or distance covered 2 months before the rut or a month before the rut, which for you would be October, the October lull. There's no difference in the movement rate the month before that, September for you and then October. It's just that then you hit the rut and now they're moving more and you're seeing them more during daylight hours. So I think the October lull is a combination of deer settling in to their fall home range. Food is changing. Now they're starting to think about the rut, territoriality, scraping behavior, locating does, and then you see this big spike come November when the rut comes in.
Yeah, that's
That was very long-winded, but hopefully I made a point.
So you're saying basically that movement is, and I think I heard this somewhere else, so you can say if this is true or not, but movement is generally increasing every day as season goes on. Right?
So think of it as, let's even start out with, let's talk about after the bachelor groups have broken up. So we're not talking about the summer or late summer, early fall, but bucks are now established. That month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks before the pre-rut, there's really no change if you just look at the distance covered every day. You just quantify. They're moving about the same time. They're covering about the same amount of ground. But then you're going to see a big spike in their movement when you get into the pre-rut. And pre-rut, I'm calling 2 to 3 weeks before the peak.
Gotcha. So it's more about the October lull, or in your case, it'd be November lull, right? It's more about visibility is changing versus movement.
I think so.
Yeah. And so at that point, for hunters, it's like, okay, is my scouting or data collection with trail cameras or even previous years collection, do I know kind of how they shift on my properties or where I hunt to then find them where they are moving, basically. Yeah. They're just different than in the summer, which makes sense.
Right.
But for a lot of hunters, if you aren't following that shift, you're not going to see the deer, right?
Maybe here's another way to say it, Adam. The way I look at it, with our data, is for you October, us November. I think that is the baseline. I think that is your normal deer movements. It's just then when you add the rut into it, you see a spike. You see an increase.
Yeah.
But it's like a lot of people have that reversed, in that the deer, you're seeing more deer, getting them on camera, etc. Well, you're at a kind of an accelerated time there. That's abnormally high. October was probably normal, and then a month after the rut is back to normal, back to baseline.
Right. Yep. Yeah, that's a good way to view it. I think a lot of times we expect to just see these deer running everywhere, or we really want that, right? But it's dependent. That only happens a short segment of the year.
Yeah.
Back to the idea of tortuosity. So these deer really getting in smaller areas, maybe, or cover, basically, right, when pressure's on. And we hear talk about nocturnal bucks, right? The idea that a buck will only move at dark or during the cover of darkness. Or turning bucks nocturnal, right, is another thing I hear a lot. And then you hear like, oh, that buck's unkillable. What would the, research say about those things?
Well, there has been some research I've seen at conferences we go to and so forth, to where there will be, I would call it a case study, not a population study, but a case study, where a particular individual buck in a place with very, very high hunting pressure, that they documented that buck would not expose himself out in the open until after dark. So yeah, there can be certain places, times, and individual bucks that just aren't going to move during daylight hours. But looking at our data, where we've got 50 to 60 animals collared and we're looking at them for 2 years, I think it's just really safe to say, and I didn't examine every single buck for every single day, but just in general, looking at all of those, we never saw a pattern of a particular buck not moving during daylight hours. Now, it is still crepuscular. It is still, again, those movements are centered around sun up, give or take, and around sunset, give or take. But they were always, if we just want to use the afternoon, for example, those bucks were always on their feet before sundown. It just might be that they are on their feet in cover. And if you look, at least in the South, Adam, when you do a survey, I'll ask you. You got to do the deer IQ test on me, so I'm gonna throw you a question.
No, I'm getting the yeah.
Where do most people hunt?
They hunt in where they can see well.
Okay, where is that typically? I'll say in the Southeast. Where are most stands located?
Yeah, probably on food plots or things like that.
Yeah. So you're assuming that buck is, quote, nocturnal because it is not on that food plot fully visible before sundown. Mm-hmm. That buck could have been on his feet an hour before sundown, but moving through the woods or moving adjacent to cover, and you just didn't see it.
Right. So people maybe are attributing their changes in their, again, visibility of deer, right? Like, well, I was seeing this deer or getting trail cam pictures of this deer before season or early in season on the food plot or wherever it might be, right? And now I'm not, right? So this buck has turned nocturnal, is the phrase. And maybe where you are, he's just wised up and he's moving somewhere else, because he knows he's being hunted, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way, indeed, that buck may be nocturnal in terms of coming to that food plot.
Mm-hmm. But deer are always moving somewhere. Again, getting back to the needs of deer, right? They need, well, it's kind of funny, but like if a person sat still for days on end, that's unhealthy. They'd get blood clots or something, right? So deer need to move. And they need food, they need water. They have these needs. It's just, are they doing it where you are or where you can hunt them or not? And are you training the deer in their behaviors versus just reacting to their behaviors as a hunter? Right. A lot of times we're training them, I feel.
I completely agree.
And then the idea of an unkillable buck. And again, some of these things I agree with if you really think about them. But if you look at the big picture, like you would probably say then that all bucks are killable. But if I only have 10 acres, right, not every buck is killable probably on my property. Because he's choosing to live more over here on this other property. And that's where he's more daylight active. And I've got to draw him way over here in the daylight, and he just never gets there in time, right?
That's right.
And so that buck might be unkillable to me, but for the next guy 2 properties over, he's very killable if he plays his cards right. And that's maybe something I can't control, And I think a lot of guys get hung up on trail cam pictures they get, and I've been there too, where I get this nighttime trail cam picture or several of this big buck, but it's always at night, right? But you get caught up in trying to shoot that buck, so you're passing up other bucks and all this stuff that are shootable to you, right? That are in daylight for the chance or the hopes that this buck's going to show up in daylight, and it might just be a pipe dream, really, for certain deer.
That's right.
So I
I
think
think you
that's,
explained that perfectly.
yeah,
Yes.
being honest. So all bucks are shootable. There's no unkillable buck. It's not like they're made out of stainless steel or something. But depending on where you are and where they choose to be daylight active, and all you can do is up the odds that they could be daylight active or want to be on your property or where you hunt.
Yeah, it's just the time that it is killable may not be on your property. And the other caveat would be you weren't lucky enough to be on your property during the peak of the rut when the buck was chasing the doe. Because that's
Yeah,
when you throw all the rules out at that time. When there's an estrus
right.
doe, that buck is going to move and chase her during daylight hours. And then it's just random luck where that occurs.
Yeah, so what are some, as we kind of think about that, so we know tortuosity increases as hunting pressure gets on. That's studies show that, and I think hunters would probably agree. Yeah, we kind of knew that one, right? But it does it pretty quickly. And so what are some practical things that hunters can do when, I guess, to put the odds in their favor, as we just kind of mentioned, to give the chance for these deer to come by my stand when I can be there?
Easier said than done. And there's certainly a spatial scale to this, but disturbing the deer as infrequently as possible. So if there's a way that the deer could sense in some way that this property, this 50 acres or 300 acres or whatever, is more of a refuge, that they're not continually day in and day out getting disturbed, bumped, shot at, etc., hearing you, smelling you, etc. I think that is something very proactive that you can do to up the odds.
Yeah, that's seems simple, but easier said than done. I think I would say the more spots you have to hunt, the better. I mean, that's everybody wants a ton of spots to hunt, right? But sometimes we have limited resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
Limited time, limited places to hunt. Permission's tough to get. But the more options you have, that is much easier, and it lets you still hunt, right? I think the problem is we want to hunt during hunting season, and if I have one spot, I'm going to overhunt it, you know. So that's a really good tip there. So
The other thing you can do, Adam, with that is being proactive about when you're picking these places to hunt. You know, we spend, rightfully so, we spend a lot of time saying this is going to be the perfect place for a north wind. I think the deer are going to come through here. You know, wind should be in my favor, etc. And we don't put any consideration into the disturbance part of, am I going to be able to get into that spot and out of that spot? Not necessarily just disturbing the buck of interest, but disturbing the deer population. That's really, really tough to do that.
yeah, it takes a lot of planning and forethought and
Mm-hmm.
knowing a property or really studying that. Yeah, and I interviewed Bill Winke a couple years ago about that, and it's flipping the mentality that there might be a hot spot on the property, but can you hunt it without alerting any deer? Because if you alert does, a lot of people think, oh, at least it wasn't that buck I'm trying to shoot, but they're telling all the other deer information, right?
Yeah.
And so really it's all deer. Like, what's the best spot or spots you can hunt where you have zero to very little impact getting in and getting out, right? At any point in time during the hunt. And that's your best spot, not the spot that's necessarily the hottest on your property. Well, those are some great tips, Dr. Strickland. Thanks again for joining us. Tell us and everybody listening here what's going on with the MSU Deer Lab and your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a podcast called Deer University, and it's not a hunting podcast per se. It's a deer biology and deer management with implications for hunting. So a lot of very similar to the stuff we're talking about today. Steve and I and guests, we basically talk about the latest research and then what's the application for deer management and deer hunting. So please tune into that. And it's on all the platforms where you get podcasts. And you might want to check out our YouTube channel as well. I think we've got 90 or 100 videos up there now. So again, just explaining deer behavior, things like we're talking about here, deer movement ecology. We also have a lot of our seminars that Steve and I, from our deer workshops and seminars, we've recorded those and turned them into videos. So just lots of content there for you. And then also, if you're into social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc., you can follow us, MSU Deer Lab, on both those platforms and get little tidbits and photos and figures and stuff we see and think.
Awesome. Yeah. So really good resource there with the science that you can, then try to apply to your hunting situation. I've also seen some cool videos of the actual, if you want to see the time lapse, I guess, of these collared buck movements. You have some of those as well, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, we got several of those. So if you like watching videos of buck little dots moving across the landscape, we've got a pile of them. Yeah.
Yeah, some pretty cool stuff. Well, thanks again for joining us here, Dr. Strickland.
Absolutely. Happy to.
All right, and now for your high IQ takeaways and challenges. What can you do to change your approach so you inflict less hunting pressure in these two key areas? By getting more places to hunt so you can spread your hunts out more, and by being more smart and strategic with the win of your hunts. Those are two key areas to really think about. And next time we're going to dive into a new topic and probably the most controversial subject in hunting that's out there that affects pretty much every hunter. And we'll get a handful of perspectives on it from scientists, regular hunters, and also a deer farmer. What is it? You won't want to miss it. Check out our next episode about that, and I'll see you then.